The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the small courthouse as Margaret Reynolds sat nervously clutching her purse, her knuckles white against the worn leather. At 42 years old, she had thought the days of paternity questions were behind her, settled 17 years ago when her daughter Sophia was born. But here she was, back in a courtroom, not just questioning who fathered her child, but now facing an even more devastating mystery about her own origins. The case had started simply enough 3 months ago when Sophia needed a kidney transplant and the family underwent genetic testing. What the tests revealed sent shockwaves through 3 generations of the Reynolds family. Margaret wasn't biologically related to either of her parents, something no one had ever suspected or disclosed. Her mother Dorothy had passed away 5 years earlier, taking whatever secrets she held to the grave. Her father, Robert Reynolds, now 78 and suffering from dementia, couldn't provide coherent answers about what had happened nearly 4 decades ago. The situation became even more complicated when Sophia's paternity came into question during the medical testing. The man Margaret had always believed was Sophia's father, her ex-husband Derek Williams, showed no genetic markers indicating paternity. Derek had been paying child support for 17 years, had been present at Sophia's birth, and had his name on the birth certificate. He was devastated by the news, not because he loved Sophia any less, but because he felt betrayed by Margaret's apparent deception. Margaret insisted she had been faithful during their marriage, and that Derek was the only possibility. She had only been with one other man in her entire life, and that was years before she met Derek. The medical crisis that brought them all together now threatened to tear apart whatever remained of their fractured family. Sophia lay in a hospital bed, her kidney function declining, desperately needing a donor match while the adults in her life unraveled the mysteries of her conception and her mother's birth. Judge Helena Morrison reviewed the case files with growing concern, her 20 years on the bench having presented many complex situations, but never one quite like this. Before her sat not 1 but 2 paternity mysteries spanning 2 generations, intertwined in ways that demanded careful legal and emotional navigation. The first petition before the court was filed by Derek Williams, seeking to establish non-paternity of Sophia Williams and terminate his child support obligations. The second petition, filed just weeks later by Margaret Reynolds herself, sought to compel genetic testing of several individuals who might provide answers about her own biological parents. Margaret had done extensive research after discovering she wasn't related to the people who raised her, poring through old hospital records, interviewing elderly family friends, and even hiring a private investigator. What she uncovered suggested that in the summer of 1982, when Dorothy Reynolds was supposed to be pregnant with Margaret, she may have actually been struggling with infertility. Several people remembered Dorothy being unusually secretive during that time, declining to see friends and family, claiming pregnancy complications that required bed rest. But a former neighbor, now in her 90s, recalled something different. She remembered Dorothy and Robert taking a sudden trip that lasted several weeks, returning with an infant they claimed had been born prematurely. The neighbor had always thought it odd because Dorothy showed no signs of having recently given birth, no postpartum exhaustion, no physical changes that typically accompany delivery. She had kept these observations to herself for decades, assuming she had simply misremembered or misunderstood. It wasn't until Margaret tracked her down and asked specific questions that the elderly woman shared her long-held suspicions. Margaret's investigation also uncovered that in 1982, there was a private adoption facilitator operating in their region who later was shut down for ethical violations. This facilitator had allegedly arranged numerous gray market adoptions, some of which skirted legal requirements and proper documentation. The courtroom filled with an unusual array of individuals, each holding a piece of the puzzle that might solve one or both mysteries. Derek Williams sat on one side, accompanied by his attorney, his face showing the strain of months of emotional turmoil. He loved Sophia as his daughter, had raised her from birth, coached her soccer teams, helped with homework, and been there for every milestone. But the betrayal he felt from Margaret cut deep, and the financial burden of 17 years of child support payments made under false pretenses gnawed at him. Beside Margaret sat her half-sister, or who she had believed was her half-sister, Patricia Reynolds Chen. Patricia was the biological daughter of Robert and Dorothy, born 5 years after Margaret, and she was grappling with the revelation that the sister she had grown up with wasn't actually related to her by blood. Patricia had agreed to provide DNA samples and testify about what she remembered from her childhood, though at 37 she had been too young to recall the circumstances of Margaret's arrival in the family. Also present was James Thornton, a man Margaret had briefly dated during a difficult period in her early 20s before she met Derek. James had been shocked to receive a call from Margaret after more than 20 years, asking if he would submit to paternity testing for Sophia. He had been even more shocked to learn that Margaret genuinely didn't remember being intimate with him. Margaret had been going through a severe depression at the time, was on medication that affected her memory, and had been drinking heavily. James admitted that they had been together during that period, but he too couldn't provide clear details about specific encounters or precautions taken. There was also an older woman named Ruth Carmichael, the former adoption facilitator, now 86 and in poor health, who had been subpoenaed to testify about her records from 1982. She arrived with her own attorney, clearly reluctant to discuss activities that had occurred over 40 years ago and might still carry legal implications despite statutes of limitations. Judge Morrison called the court to order and began by addressing the elephant in the room: how to handle two interconnected paternity cases that spanned generations and involved urgent medical needs. Sophia's kidney disease was progressing, and finding a biological relative who might be a transplant match was time-sensitive. The judge explained that she would first address the more recent case, the question of Sophia's paternity, because it had immediate medical implications. Then she would turn to the question of Margaret's biological parents, which might also provide potential donors for Sophia if family connections could be established. The judge asked Margaret to approach the stand first to explain in her own words the timeline of events surrounding Sophia's conception. Margaret took a deep breath and began recounting the story she had told many times but was now viewed with skepticism. She married Derek in August of 1997, and they had tried to conceive immediately. By December, she wasn't yet pregnant, and they consulted a fertility specialist who suggested they continue trying naturally for at least a year before pursuing interventions. In February of 1998, Margaret believed she became pregnant based on a home test, but a miscarriage at what she thought was 8 weeks devastated her. She fell into a depression, and Derek, overwhelmed by his demanding new job, wasn't as emotionally available as she needed. This was the period, March through May of 1998, when Margaret's memories became hazy. She admitted to the court that she had been prescribed antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication, that she had been drinking despite the medications, and that there were days and even weeks from that period she couldn't fully recall. Derek had been traveling extensively for work during those months. Margaret remembered feeling abandoned and alone. It was during this time that she reconnected with James Thornton at a mutual friend's party. They had dated years earlier, and he was sympathetic to her struggles. Margaret's voice trembled as she continued her testimony, describing the fragmented memories of that spring in 1998. She remembered having coffee with James several times, remembered him being kind and supportive, remembered feeling less alone when he was around, but when it came to specific details about whether their relationship had become physical, her memory failed her. She had no recollection of being intimate with him, yet she couldn't say with certainty that it hadn't happened. The medications she had been taking were later linked to memory problems and blackouts, especially when combined with alcohol, which she admitted to using heavily during that period. Her therapist at the time had eventually noted in her records that Margaret was experiencing dissociative episodes and had gaps in her memory. By June of 1998, Margaret had stopped taking the problematic medications, had reduced her drinking, and was working on her mental health. She and Derek had begun couples counseling and were rebuilding their relationship. In August of 1998, she discovered she was pregnant with Sophia. Neither she nor Derek questioned the pregnancy because they had been trying to conceive and had been intimate regularly throughout the year, including the spring months when Margaret was struggling. The timing seemed to fit with Derek as the father, and Margaret genuinely believed he was. Sophia was born in April 1999, a healthy baby girl who became the center of their universe. Derek was present for the birth, cut the umbilical cord, and from that moment on, considered himself Sophia's father in every meaningful way. The marriage itself didn't survive other stresses, and they divorced when Sophia was 7, but Derek remained actively involved in his daughter's life. For 17 years, no one questioned Sophia's paternity. She had Derek's last name, he was listed as father on all documents, and their family operated as any other post-divorce family with shared custody and child support arrangements. The truth only emerged when Sophia collapsed at school 6 months ago. Dr. Catherine Yee, the geneticist who had conducted the medical testing that exposed both paternity questions, took the stand to explain the science behind the revelations. She described how Sophia had been diagnosed with a rare genetic kidney disease that was progressing rapidly. The first step in finding a potential living donor was testing immediate family members for compatibility and genetic markers. Derek had been tested first as Sophia's presumed father, and the results showed no parent-child relationship. The genetic markers were incompatible in ways that definitively ruled out paternity. Dr. Yee had delivered this news to Derek privately first, suggesting there might have been a sample mix-up at the lab. But a second test confirmed the results. She then tested Margaret, who showed a clear biological relationship with Sophia as her mother. The doctor explained that the testing didn't stop there because they needed to find a donor quickly. They tested Margaret's parents next, hoping Sophia's maternal grandparents might be matches. Robert Reynolds was tested despite his advanced age and dementia, and Patricia Reynolds Chen was also tested as Sophia's aunt. The results were shocking. Neither Robert nor Patricia showed any genetic relationship to Margaret, which meant they had no genetic relationship to Sophia either. Dr. Yee said she initially thought there must have been another sample error, but repeated testing confirmed what seemed impossible. Margaret Reynolds was not biologically related to the people she had always known as her family. The doctor testified that in her 20-year career, she had occasionally uncovered surprise paternity situations, but discovering 2 generations of unknown biological relationships in one family was unprecedented. She explained to the court that the genetic evidence was conclusive, and that both Derek's non-paternity of Sophia and Margaret's non-biological relationship to her parents were established beyond scientific doubt. The question now was who the biological parents actually were, which was crucial not just for personal identity, but for finding potential kidney donors for Sophia before her condition became irreversible. James Thornton approached the witness stand with visible reluctance, his discomfort apparent as he prepared to discuss events from over 2 decades ago. He confirmed that he and Margaret had dated briefly in their early 20s, that the relationship had ended amicably, and that they had lost touch for several years until reconnecting at a party in the spring of 1998. James testified that Margaret had seemed different during that reconnection, fragile and not quite herself. He remembered she was drinking heavily at the party, and he had been concerned about her. They exchanged numbers and met for coffee several times over the following weeks. He recalled that Margaret talked about her recent miscarriage, her struggling marriage, and feeling very alone. James admitted that he still had feelings for Margaret from their earlier relationship, and that he had hoped they might rekindle something. He testified that they had been physically intimate on at least 2 occasions that he clearly remembered, once at his apartment and once at a hotel after a concert they attended together. He stated that they had not used protection because Margaret had mentioned she was already trying to get pregnant with her husband and didn't think pregnancy was something to avoid. James said that at the time he assumed she knew what she was doing and was making conscious choices about being with him. It wasn't until Margaret contacted him months ago, over 20 years later, that he learned she had no memory of their intimate encounters. This revelation disturbed him deeply because it raised questions about consent and Margaret's state of mind during that period. He insisted he had no intention of taking advantage of her, and that at the time she had seemed coherent and willing, though clearly in emotional pain. He acknowledged now that she had been in no state to make sound decisions, and that he should have been more responsible, regardless of what she said she wanted at the time. When asked why he never contacted Margaret again after that spring, James explained that Margaret had called him in late May and told him she was recommitting to her marriage and that they couldn't see each other anymore. The attorney representing Derek Williams stood to question James about the timeline and the probability that he was Sophia's biological father. The attorney established that James and Margaret's encounters occurred in late March through early May of 1998, and Sophia was born in mid-April 1999, which fit the timing for conception during that period. The attorney presented medical records showing that Derek had been traveling for work extensively during March and April of 1998, being out of state for 3 of the 4 weeks in March and 2 of the 4 weeks in April. While Derek and Margaret had been intimate during his time home, the frequency was limited by his travel schedule and the strain in their relationship during that period. The attorney argued that given the number of encounters James described, the timing, and Derek's limited opportunities, it was more probable than not that James Thornton was Sophia's biological father. Derek's attorney then addressed the court about the legal and financial implications. Derek had paid child support faithfully for 17 years, totaling over $200,000 based on a misrepresentation of paternity. While Derek's attorney acknowledged that Margaret's misrepresentation appeared to be unintentional due to her memory issues during conception, the fact remained that Derek had supported a child who was not biologically his for nearly 2 decades. The attorney requested that the court not only terminate ongoing child support obligations, but also consider requiring Margaret to reimburse Derek for past payments, or alternatively, requiring James Thornton to assume responsibility for past support if he was established as the biological father. The attorney also raised the question of Sophia's birth certificate and legal name, arguing that if James was the father, the birth certificate should be corrected to reflect accurate parentage. Judge Morrison listened carefully, taking notes as the attorney laid out Derek's position. She then asked Derek to approach the stand to testify about his own wishes regarding his relationship with Sophia moving forward. Derek took the stand with tears already forming in his eyes. Derek Williams spoke directly to the judge, his voice breaking with emotion as he tried to explain the impossible position he found himself in. He testified that Sophia was his daughter in every way that mattered except biologically. He had been there for her first steps, her first words, her first day of school. He had stayed up nights with her when she was sick, helped her learn to ride a bike, taught her to swim. He had attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every soccer game. When he and Margaret divorced, he fought for joint custody because he couldn't imagine not being an active part of Sophia's daily life. He had introduced her to his parents as their granddaughter, to his siblings as their niece. She called him Dad and always had. Derek testified that when he first learned he wasn't Sophia's biological father, his initial reaction was anger and betrayal. He felt that Margaret must have known, must have lied to him, must have trapped him into a parental role under false pretenses. But as he learned more about Margaret's mental health crisis during that period, and her genuine lack of memory about what happened, His anger shifted. He was still hurt, still processing the genetic revelation, but he no longer believed Margaret had intentionally deceived him. His feelings about Sophia hadn't changed at all. She was still his daughter. The biological connection didn't determine his love for her. However, Derek testified that he was also struggling financially. He had been paying substantial child support while also trying to save for his own retirement and manage his current expenses. If Sophia wasn't biologically his, and if James Thornton was identified as the father, Derek felt it was only fair that James assume the financial responsibility going forward. Derek stated he didn't want to completely terminate his legal relationship with Sophia, but wanted the financial obligations to shift to the biological father while maintaining some form of continued relationship with the girl he had raised as his daughter. He wanted Sophia to know he still loved her, still considered her his daughter, but needed the court to recognize the unique circumstances and adjust the legal and financial arrangements accordingly. The judge then turned her attention to the second mystery that had emerged from the genetic testing, calling Margaret's sister Patricia Reynolds, Chen, to the stand. Patricia testified about growing up with Margaret, sharing childhood memories that painted a picture of a normal sibling relationship in a middle-class family. She was 5 years younger than Margaret, which meant she was born in 1987, 5 years after Margaret's arrival in 1982. Patricia had no memory of a time before Margaret was part of the family, having been too young. She testified that their parents, Dorothy and Robert Reynolds, had treated both daughters equally and lovingly, with no hint that Margaret was not their biological child. There were no whispered family secrets, no awkward explanations, no different treatment that would suggest Margaret's origins were anything other than what everyone believed. Patricia said she had been devastated to learn that Margaret wasn't her biological sister, though emotionally she felt no different about their relationship. They had shared a lifetime of experiences, and genetics didn't change that bond. However, Patricia also testified that after the DNA results revealed the truth, she started questioning some of her childhood memories and family stories. She recalled that there were very few photographs of their mother pregnant with Margaret, which seemed odd given that parents typically document first pregnancies extensively. There were also very few photos of Margaret as a newborn, with most early photos beginning when Margaret appeared to be several months old. Patricia remembered asking her mother about this once as a teenager, and Dorothy had explained that their camera had broken during her pregnancy with Margaret, and they hadn't replaced it until later. At the time, this seemed like a reasonable explanation, but now Patricia wondered if it had been a cover story. Patricia also testified that she remembered her father once making an odd comment when she was about 12 years old, during an argument with her mother. Patricia had walked into the room during what seemed like a serious disagreement, and she heard her father say something like, "After everything we went through to have her," in reference to Margaret. Ruth Carmichael, the former adoption facilitator, was called to the stand next, and her testimony had the potential to finally solve the mystery of Margaret's origins. Ruth was now 86, frail but mentally sharp, and she arrived with decades, old records in bankers' boxes that her attorney helped carry into the courtroom. She began by providing background on her work in the early 1980s, explaining that she operated a service that helped connect birth mothers who wanted to place children for adoption with families hoping to adopt. She insisted that her work had been legitimate and helpful, though she acknowledged that some of her methods had later been deemed problematic by changing regulations and ethical standards. Ruth explained that in the late 1970s and early 1980s, before modern adoption regulations were fully established, there was a gray area in private adoptions where facilitators like herself operated with less oversight than would later be required. She matched birth mothers with adoptive families, arranged for medical care, handled payments, and sometimes helped families navigate the documentation process in ways that weren't entirely transparent, but weren't technically illegal at the time. When Margaret's attorney presented her with records from 1982, Ruth took her time reviewing them through thick reading glasses. She confirmed that she had worked with a couple named Robert and Dorothy Reynolds in the summer of 1982. According to her records, Dorothy had been struggling with infertility and had suffered multiple miscarriages. The couple desperately wanted a child and had come to Ruth after being discouraged by the long waiting lists and invasive screening processes of traditional adoption agencies. Ruth had matched them with a young birth mother who wished to remain anonymous, a 17-year-old girl who was pregnant and not in a position to raise a child. The records showed that the birth mother was from a different state, had come to stay in a private maternity home that Ruth operated, and had given birth in July of 1982 to a healthy baby girl who was placed with Robert and Dorothy Reynolds. Ruth continued her testimony, explaining the process that Robert and Dorothy Reynolds had gone through to adopt Margaret, though she used the term adoption loosely. She acknowledged that the arrangement had not gone through traditional legal adoption channels. Instead, she had facilitated what was sometimes called a private placement, or gray market adoption, where the birth mother signed over her parental rights directly to the adoptive parents with minimal legal oversight. Ruth explained that in some cases, she helped families create the appearance that the adoptive mother had given birth to the child naturally, which avoided the adoption process entirely and allowed the child to be issued an original birth certificate listing the adoptive parents as the biological parents. When asked directly if this is what happened with Margaret, Ruth hesitated before confirming that yes, this appeared to be the case based on her records. She explained that Dorothy Reynolds had wanted everyone to believe the child was her biological daughter, fearing stigma and judgment in their community about adoption. Ruth had arranged for Dorothy to appear pregnant, coached her on what to say, and helped the couple travel to another state during the final months of the pregnancy, where they stayed until the birth mother delivered. Ruth had connections with a sympathetic doctor who signed a birth certificate listing Dorothy and Robert as the biological parents, and when the couple returned home with infant Margaret, their community simply accepted the story that she had been born while they were away. Ruth testified that at the time, she believed she was helping families and birth mothers in difficult situations. The birth mothers received medical care and support during pregnancy. The babies went to loving families who desperately wanted children, and everyone involved got what they needed. She didn't fully understand, then, how such arrangements might affect the children later in life, robbing them of knowledge about their biological origins and medical history. Ruth also didn't foresee how genetic testing would eventually make such secrets impossible to maintain, which is exactly what had happened with Margaret and Sophia. Margaret's attorney pressed Ruth Carmichael for information about the biological mother, explaining that knowing Margaret's biological family was crucial not just for emotional closure, but for finding potential kidney donors for Sophia. Ruth initially resisted, citing the confidentiality agreements she had made with birth mothers and adoptive families over 40 years ago. However, Judge Morrison explained that while Ruth's desire to protect privacy was understandable, the urgent medical need for Sophia created an exception to normal confidentiality rules. The judge ordered Ruth to provide whatever information she had about Margaret's biological parents. Ruth reluctantly revealed that according to her records, Margaret's biological mother was a 17-year-old named Jennifer Hawthorne from a small town in Ohio. Jennifer had become pregnant by her 18-year-old boyfriend, and both sets of parents had pressured the young couple to place the baby for adoption rather than attempt to raise a child as teenagers. Ruth's records indicated that Jennifer had been hesitant about the adoption, struggling with the decision throughout her pregnancy, but ultimately signed the papers shortly after giving birth. The records also contained the name of the biological father, Michael Chen, though Ruth noted that he had not been present for the birth or the adoption proceedings. Ruth explained that in her experience, birth fathers were often less involved in the adoption process, sometimes not even knowing about the pregnancy or placement. Ruth's records included contact information for Jennifer Hawthorne from 1982, though she cautioned that it was over 40 years old and Jennifer had likely moved, married, and changed her name. The address was for Jennifer's parents' home in Dayton, Ohio. There was no contact information for Michael Chen beyond his name and age at the time. Margaret sat stunned in the courtroom, hearing her biological mother's name for the first time and learning that she had been the product of a teen pregnancy, given up by a girl who was younger than Sophia was now. The revelation of Michael Chen's name caused an immediate reaction from Patricia Reynolds. Chen, who gasped audibly and asked to speak. Judge Morrison called for order and asked Patricia to explain her outburst. Patricia testified that Chen was her married name, that her husband David Chen had a father named Michael Chen, and that Michael would have been approximately 18 years old in 1982. If this was the same Michael Chen, it would mean that Margaret's biological father and Patricia's father-in-law were the same person, creating an extraordinarily complicated family connection. Patricia explained that Michael Chen, now in his early 60s, lived in California and had been married to David's mother Linda for over 40 years. They had 3 children together, including Patricia's husband David. Patricia had known Michael as her father-in-law for 15 years, since she and David met in college and later married. She testified that Michael had grown up in Ohio, which matched Ruth's records, and he had told family stories about being young and reckless as a teenager before eventually meeting Linda, going to college, and building a stable life. Patricia had never heard him mention a teenage girl and named Jennifer or a baby placed for adoption, but she acknowledged that this was exactly the kind of secret someone might keep buried for decades. The implications were staggering. If Michael Chen was indeed Margaret's biological father, then Margaret and Patricia's husband David were half-siblings. This meant Patricia's children were biologically related to her sister Margaret through their father's side. It also meant that David's mother Linda and David's siblings were biological relatives of Margaret and Sophia. Judge Morrison recognized the urgency of confirming this connection, both for the personal relationships involved and for the medical implications. She ordered that Michael Chen be contacted immediately and asked to provide a DNA sample to determine if he was Margaret's biological father and therefore Sophia's biological grandfather. The judge called for a brief recess to allow Patricia to contact her husband and father-in-law about the situation unfolding in court. The court reconvened 2 days later after emergency DNA testing had been conducted on Michael Chen, who had flown in from California after receiving the shocking news from his son David. The results confirmed what now seemed almost inevitable given the cascade of revelations. Michael Chen was indeed Margaret's biological father, with a 99.9% probability of paternity. Michael took the stand looking pale and shaken, testifying that he had no knowledge that Jennifer Hawthorne had been pregnant with his child or that a baby had been placed for adoption. He and Jennifer had dated during their senior year of high school and into the summer after graduation. Their relationship had been serious, at least in the way teenage relationships are serious, and they had been sexually active. Michael testified that in late summer of 1982, right before he was supposed to leave for college, Jennifer had suddenly broken up with him with no real explanation. She had been distant and strange for a few weeks before that, and when he tried to get answers, her parents told him to leave her alone and that she needed space. He had left for college heartbroken and confused, and he never learned what had caused the sudden breakup. Now, 42 years later, he understood that Jennifer had been pregnant, that her parents had arranged for the adoption, and that Jennifer had been forced to push him away to protect the secret. Michael testified that he wished desperately that he had known, that he would have wanted to be involved, that he would have wanted to know his daughter. He looked directly at Margaret with tears streaming down his face and said he was sorry, that he never would have abandoned her if he had known she existed. Margaret was crying too, overwhelmed by meeting her biological father for the first time at 40, 2 years old. Michael also testified about his family situation, explaining that he had married Linda 3 years after high school, that they had built a good life together, and that they had 3 children who were now adults themselves. His family had been shocked by the revelation but supportive. Linda had been understandably upset about learning her husband had a daughter from a previous relationship, even though the relationship predated their marriage and Michael had been completely unaware. The medical implications of confirming Margaret's biological parents became the immediate focus as doctor. Yi was recalled to explain the testing that had been conducted on Michael Chen and his family. Michael had immediately volunteered to be tested as a potential kidney donor for Sophia, his biological granddaughter. His 3 other children, Margaret's half-siblings, had also volunteered for testing. Additionally, efforts were underway to locate Jennifer Hawthorne to see if she would participate in testing as well. Dr. Yi reported that Michael Chen was not a suitable match for Sophia due to age, underlying health conditions, and incompatible markers. However, one of Michael's children with Linda, Margaret's half, brother Jason Chen, showed promising compatibility markers and was undergoing additional testing to determine if he could serve as a living donor. The doctor testified that Jason was healthy, relatively young at 38, and appeared to be an excellent potential match for Sophia based on preliminary testing. Final compatibility testing would take another week, but Dr. Yi was optimistic that Jason would be approved as a donor if he chose to proceed. Jason Chen was called to testify briefly, explaining that despite the shocking nature of learning he had a half-sister he never knew existed and a half-niece who desperately needed help. His decision to offer to donate a kidney was straightforward. Sophia was family, and family helped each other. He had spent the past 2 days getting to know Margaret and Sophia, and he felt a connection to them despite the unusual circumstances of their meeting. He was committed to proceeding with the donation if the final tests confirmed compatibility. The courtroom had become emotional as the human dimensions of these legal paternity questions became evident. What had started as clinical questions of biological relationships had evolved into a story of loss, connection, and the profound ways that family extends beyond biology while still being shaped by it. Judge Morrison acknowledged the emotional weight of the proceedings and announced that she would now turn to the specific legal petitions before her. Regarding the question of Sophia's paternity and Derek Williams's petition, Judge Morrison explained her ruling carefully. The genetic evidence clearly established that Derek Williams was not Sophia's biological father, and that James Thornton was almost certainly the biological father based on timeline, opportunity, and the process of elimination. However, the judge noted that paternity law was not simply about biology, but also about established relationships and the best interests of the child. Derek had served as Sophia's father for 17 years, was listed on her birth certificate, and had a legal parent-child relationship that had been established through his actions and the passage of time regardless of biology. The judge referenced legal precedent regarding equitable estoppel in paternity cases, explaining that courts sometimes prevent a person from denying paternity even when biology suggests otherwise, particularly when the child has relied on that relationship and would be harmed by its termination. However, the judge also acknowledged that Derek had been operating under a misrepresentation, albeit an unintentional one, and that continuing to require him to provide child support when another man was the biological father created an inequity. Judge Morrison ruled that Derek's ongoing child support obligation would be terminated immediately, but she declined to order reimbursement for past support. She explained that Derek had received the benefit of a father-child relationship during those 17 years, that he had acknowledged paternity at birth without genetic testing, and that Margaret's misrepresentation had been unintentional due to mental health issues and memory problems. The judge ruled that James Thornton would be established as Sophia's biological father and would assume child support obligations going forward. However, Derek Williams would retain certain parental rights if both he and Sophia wished to maintain their relationship, including visitation and involvement in major decisions. The judge explained that she was essentially creating a situation where Sophia had three legal parents: Margaret as her mother, James as her biological father with support obligations, and Derek as her psychological father with limited ongoing rights based on their established relationship. Judge Morrison then addressed Margaret's petition regarding her own origins and the broader implications for the family. The court officially acknowledged that Margaret was the biological daughter of Jennifer Hawthorne and Michael Chen. Born in July 1982 and placed with Robert and Dorothy Reynolds through a private adoption facilitated by Ruth Carmichael. The judge ordered that Margaret's original birth certificate, which listed Robert and Dorothy as her biological parents, be amended to reflect her adoptive status while creating a new record identifying her biological parents. The judge also ordered Ruth Carmichael to provide all remaining information in her possession that might help locate Jennifer Hawthorne, as Jennifer was not only Margaret's biological mother, but also Sophia's biological grandmother and another potential donor for kidney transplant. Judge Morrison addressed the ethical questions raised by Ruth's adoption practices, noting that while the statutes of limitations had long since expired on any potential criminal charges, the court strongly disapproved of the methods used to create false birth certificates and erase biological parentage without proper legal adoption procedures. The judge acknowledged the complex emotions involved for everyone in the courtroom, particularly for Margaret, who had discovered at 40, too, that her entire understanding of her identity was based on a well-intentioned but ultimately deceptive adoption arrangement. The judge commended Michael Chen for stepping forward immediately to acknowledge his daughter and his family for their willingness to help Sophia. She also acknowledged the extraordinary situation Patricia Reynolds, Chen found herself in, having her sister turn out to be her husband's half-sister, creating a biological connection where none had existed before. As the proceedings concluded, Judge Morrison expressed hope that Sophia would receive the kidney transplant she desperately needed, and that this family, now understanding their true biological connections, could heal from the revelations and build authentic relationships based on truth rather than secrets. The double mystery of paternity across 2 generations had been solved, but the human work of processing these truths and moving forward as a reconfigured family was just beginning.